What follows is an investigation into reports, not scientific consensus. The Amazon basin has generated, over more than a century of documented expeditions, a body of witness accounts describing anacondas at dimensions that exceed every officially measured specimen. These reports have not been systematically collected, analyzed, or refuted. They have, for the most part, simply accumulated in field journals, in indigenous oral histories, in missionary correspondence, in the private notes of naturalists who judge the professional risk of formal publication too high. This script attempts to do what the scientific literature has not yet done: lay the coordinates of those accounts against the geography of the Western Amazon and ask why they keep pointing to the same place. Something is hiding in the Western Amazon, not metaphorically, not as legend alone, but physically, concretely, coiled in flooded channels where cartographers still mark blank space. For more than a century, expedition logs, indigenous oral histories, and the accounts of field surveyors have described the same creature in the same places with a consistency that refuses to be dismissed. The reports speak of anacondas, Eunectes murinus, the green anaconda, the largest snake by mass the modern world officially acknowledges, but at dimensions that exceed every measured specimen in every museum, every zoo, every scientific catalogue. Not by inches, by meters, and the coordinates of these encounters cluster. They gather like water finding a drain. When plotted across 100 years of documentation, the sightings concentrate with unnerving precision around a specific geographic convergence in the western Amazon basin, the Javari Valley, the upper Juruá, the margins where Peru, Brazil, and Colombia dissolve into one another beneath a canopy so dense that satellite imagery captures only an unbroken surface of chlorophyll. This is not random scatter. This is pattern. And patterns, in science as in legend, demand explanation. To understand why, one must first understand what these waters are and what they do to everything that lives within them. The Western Amazon contains two fundamentally different river systems, and the distinction between them matters enormously for what follows. The blackwater rivers, the Rio Negro, the Ituí, the countless unnamed tributaries threading between flooded routes in the Javari system, are stained dark by centuries of decomposing organic matter, low in suspended sediment but rich in dissolved tannins and humic acids. They are acidic, tea-colored, with near-zero underwater visibility. The Juruá River itself, it should be noted, is a whitewater river, sediment-rich, carrying Andean minerals in its pale clay-colored flow. But the Juruá's extraordinary meandering course, it is among the most sinuous rivers on Earth, its actual length following every curve being roughly 3 times its straight-line distance, creates hundreds of oxbow lakes and cut-off backwater channels. These backwaters, once cut off from the main channel, progressively darken as organic material accumulates and tannins build up. They become functionally blackwater environments within a whitewater river system, isolated, acidic, near-opaque, and extraordinarily productive for ambush predators. This is where the reports concentrate. Not along the Juruá's main channel, but in its labyrinthine margins. The Yanomami, the Matsés, the Mayaruna, the Marubo, the indigenous peoples who have navigated these waters for 10,000 years, do not debate the existence of anacondas beyond the official maximum. They have taxonomies for them. They have names for the largest category of serpent that go beyond ordinary Eunectes murinus. The Matsés distinguish between anacondas by age and behavioral phase, and their classification system describes a category of elder individual whose behavior differs markedly from younger animals, less active, more stationary, associated with the deepest permanent channels and the most isolated flooded forest backwaters. While Western science continues to debate whether a 10-meter anaconda is biologically possible, Communities along the upper Juruá have fishing protocols that account for something larger. These are not fairy tales encoded in ceremony. They are practical guidelines, refined across generations for surviving a river that has not changed. The Yanomami concept of the great river serpent, the monstrous aquatic being that certain shamanic traditions describe as a shaper of watercourses, appears independently in the oral traditions of peoples with no historical contact with one another across the western Amazon. Anthropologists who have documented these traditions have noted the consistency. The creature is not supernatural in the way European dragon mythology is supernatural. It is described as an animal, a very old, very large animal that behaves in specific ways, occupying specific depths, moving during specific seasons, taking specific prey. The shamanic traditions that have grown around it reflect not mysticism, but ecology, protocols for when to cross certain river sections, which channels to avoid during flood season, what disturbances in the water indicate danger. That ecological knowledge, embedded in spiritual practice, represents 10,000 years of continuous observation of the same river system. Western herpetology, which has had access to the Western Amazon for roughly a century, has not yet produced a comprehensive survey of the region's anaconda population. The indigenous knowledge baseline predates the scientific baseline by a factor of 100. The forest never tells everything at once. Subscribe to Secrets of the Amazon Jungle and continue the journey. The first documented Western encounter with an anomalously large anaconda that remains widely cited comes from Percy Fawcett, who between 1906 and 1913 conducted boundary surveys for the Bolivian and Brazilian governments along the precise river corridors where sighting reports cluster. Fawcett was a trained Royal Artillery officer and professional surveyor. His dispatches to the Royal Geographical Society were, in their cartographic and geographic content, precise enough to be used as official boundary documents. He was not prone to embellishment where precision was professionally required. In 1907, along the Rio Abunã, a tributary feeding into the Madeira River system, Fawcett reported a serpent encounter in his official field report to the Royal Geographical Society. He described a creature that reared its head and body approximately 4 feet out of the water when disturbed by his canoe, and which he estimated at 60 feet in total length. The Royal Geographical Society published this account. The zoological community of the time received it with a mixture of interest and skepticism that has never been fully resolved into either acceptance or refutation. Fawcett himself, in his personal correspondence, was characteristically precise. He had estimated the creature's length by comparison with vegetation of known scale, and he stood by the figure. What no subsequent expedition has produced, despite multiple attempts along the Abunã and adjacent river systems, is a physical specimen to either confirm or refute the report. The absence of physical evidence is not proof of absence. In the Western Amazon, it may simply be proof of how difficult the terrain is to survey. The Royal Geographical Society's records include not only Fawcett's 1907 account, but a broader pattern of large serpent references scattered through expedition reports from the late 19th and early 20th century, accounts that were individually categorized as unverified but which, taken together, trace the same geographic corridor. In the mid-20th century, prominent Brazilian herpetologists, especially those connected to institutions like the Butantan Institute, took these outsized anaconda reports seriously enough to discuss measurement, methodology, and the limits of what field data could actually prove. The details of who measured what and where remain uneven in the public record, but the underlying problem is consistent. The evidence is fragmentary, and the methods were rarely standardized. His measurements of field specimens, documented in institutional records at the Butantan, included animals that pushed or exceeded what was then considered the species maximum. The exact figures in his records have been disputed by subsequent researchers who argue that measurement methodology was insufficiently standardized, a critique that applies with equal force to most anaconda-size records in the scientific literature. The methodology problem cuts in all directions. It does not only shrink claimed giants, it also introduces uncertainty into the official maximums used to dismiss them. The question of measurement methodology is, in fact, a significant recurring problem in the scientific record. Snake skins can stretch significantly during removal and preservation, and the degree of change can vary with method, humidity, and storage conditions. This means that a living animal measured at 9 meters might produce a preserved skin that, when flattened, appears to measure 12. Conversely, skins poorly stored in tropical heat may contract, and a skin used to dispute a claimed length might measure shorter than the living animal that produced it. The net effect is that the entire historical record of anaconda maximum size, compiled largely from preserved specimens and field measurements without standardized protocols, carries an error margin that the scientific community has acknowledged but not resolved. When indigenous communities and field surveyors report animals beyond the documented maximum, the measurement evidence used to define that maximum is less definitive than its institutional authority suggests. This isn't just internet speculation. Methodological uncertainty around snake-length records is discussed in herpetological methods and measurement practice. The problem is that it rarely makes it into popular maximum size summaries. It simply has not filtered into popular summaries of what the maximum size of an anaconda is. The Javari Valley's protected status creates an extraordinary and irreducible complication for any attempt to resolve the question empirically. The Brazilian government has designated the Javari Valley Indigenous territory as one of the most strictly protected zones in the Amazon, home to one of the world's largest concentrations of uncontacted or voluntarily isolated indigenous peoples. Entry requires authorization from FUNAI, Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Agency. Unauthorized penetration of the territory carries serious criminal penalties. This means that the largest remaining tract of undisturbed anaconda habitat on the planet has been, for decades, systematically protected from the large-scale human incursion that elsewhere in the Amazon has fragmented ecosystems and disrupted the prey chains upon which apex predators depend. An intact ecosystem, undisturbed for generations, with abundant prey, stable flooded forest habitat, and minimal human hunting pressure on the apex predator at the top of its food web. If a population of genuinely anomalous anacondas exists anywhere on Earth, these are the conditions that would sustain it. The Javari is not merely where the reports cluster. It is where the biology would predict the largest individuals to be. The biological case for anomalous size in this specific environment is not a fringe argument. The principle of gigantism in apex predators occupying resource-rich, geographically stable environments is documented across the animal kingdom. The prey density of the Javari-Juruá corridor is extraordinary. In the Javari-Juruá corridor, large prey can occur at unusually high densities, especially in floodplain and backwater habitats where fish concentrate and predators follow. Caiman can be abundant in optimal conditions. Capybara may gather in large riverbank groups, and in some river systems, nesting turtles have historically formed massive seasonal aggregations. The point is simple. Where the food web is intact and prey is plentiful, apex predators have the ecological room to grow. The Western Amazon is not merely anaconda habitat, it is anaconda larder, stocked to a degree that exists nowhere else on the planet. If body mass in long-lived reptiles scales with available food supply, which the biological evidence suggests it does, then the question is not whether the largest individuals here are larger than those found in degraded habitat elsewhere. The question is, by how much? The baseline for what an undisturbed population achieves has never been formally established. All official maximums are drawn from disturbed or partially disturbed populations. The flood season adds another dimension to why the Javari-Juruá corridor produces concentrated reports. During the Época das Cheias, the annual inundation, water levels in the western basin can rise 15 meters or more above their dry season depths. The river does not merely overflow into floodplains, it enters the forest. For months, the Igapo, the flooded forest, creates a vast, shaded, humid environment where terrestrial and aquatic habitats merge completely. Large anacondas, equally comfortable in open water and dense undergrowth, become effectively unconstrained during this period. They can navigate from river channel to flooded forest to isolated backwater without ever leaving their preferred environment. A notable share of reports seem to cluster around the flood cycle, during high water and the transition back toward low water, when habitats connect, prey concentrates, and people tend to work the same productive channels. Fish concentrate in shrinking backwaters as the waters recede. Prey density spikes in precise locations. An ambush predator that has spent the flood season ranging through a vast, inundated forest converges on these high-density prey pockets. Witnesses, fishermen, river traders, expeditioners converge on the same locations, fishing the same productive spots. The encounters are not random, they follow the water. The Matsés ecological classification of anacondas by behavioral phase represents a body of observational knowledge that no formal biological study has yet attempted to test. Their description of elder individuals, animals that have shifted from active hunting to stationary ambush, that occupy permanent deep water channels for extended periods, that no longer flee from disturbance at the water's surface, has a specific biological plausibility that deserves examination. A very large, very old ectotherm, cold-blooded, requiring no energy expenditure to maintain body temperature, capable of surviving on infrequent large meals, would have no metabolic reason to move unnecessarily. An animal that does not move, does not leave trackways, does not create persistent disturbance, does not trigger camera traps designed for moving subjects. The tannin-stained water of the Javari's blackwater tributaries has a visibility measured in centimeters, not meters. Acoustic sonar surveys in these systems have been conducted at a fraction of the coverage that would be required to systematically map large stationary objects on channel bottoms. A creature whose survival strategy involves stillness, in water that conceals stillness absolutely, in a territory where human access is legally restricted. Such a creature would not need to be rare to be invisible. It would only need to be patient. Multiple documentary expeditions have entered the accessible margins of this region over the past 3 decades with the explicit intention of capturing footage of anomalously large anacondas. Most have returned with footage of large anacondas, animals in the 7 to 9 meter range, that is scientifically significant in terms of density and behavioral documentation. But that fails to resolve the question of whether the upper size range claimed in historical accounts exists. The failure to capture the anomalous specimen is cited by skeptics as evidence that it does not exist. But the same expeditions consistently document something that receives less attention. The density of large anacondas in the accessible portions of these river systems is higher than almost anywhere else on Earth. If the accessible margins support this density, the case for what the inaccessible interior might support is not closed. Herpetologists who have worked these rivers describe the experience with a consistent note of calibration shift. Their intuitions about what is normal, built from working in fragmented or disturbed habitats, require adjustment. The Western Amazon operates at a different scale. How much different at the far extreme of size distribution remains the open question. The cobra grande, in Portuguese simply the big snake, is one of the most persistent figures in Amazonian folklore, documented across dozens of distinct indigenous and caboclo communities from the mouth of the Amazon to the Peruvian headwaters. What is notable, to anyone examining this tradition analytically, is that the cobra grande is not treated as a supernatural being in most of the communities that reference it. It's described as an animal, a category of animal, the oldest, largest individuals of the anaconda lineage, that behaves differently from ordinary large anacondas. Communities along the Juruá distinguish it by specific behavioral markers. It does not flee from boats. It occupies specific deep channels associated with the richest fish concentrations. It has been known to take large prey, caiman, tapir, that ordinary large anacondas rarely attempt. Ribeirinho communities, the river people of mixed indigenous and colonial heritage who have fished these waterways for generations, maintain specific river crossing protocols associated with the cobra grande's known territories. These protocols are not performed ritually. They are performed practically, the way a fisherman anywhere in the world adjusts behavior around known hazards. The cultural encoding of dangerous animal behavior is, across every human society that has coexisted with large predators, one of the most reliable forms of ecological documentation we have. The archaeological record of the Western Amazon adds a temporal dimension that makes the sighting record harder, not easier, to dismiss. The Monte Alegre cave art sites in Pará State contain painted rock art dated to over 11,000 years before present, among the oldest documented human presence in the Americas. Among the images at Monte Alegre are serpentine figures whose proportions, rendered with a naturalism unusual in early rock art, suggest large-bodied, clearly aquatic animals. Ethnoarchaeologists who have documented these images have proposed, carefully, without overreach, that they may represent observational records of dangerous river fauna rather than purely symbolic constructions. If that interpretation is even partially correct, the tradition of recording encounters with anomalously large aquatic serpents in the Western Amazon does not begin with colonial-era missionaries or 19th century explorers. It begins 11,000 years ago on the walls of a sandstone cave, drawn by someone who had seen something enormous in the water and believed it worth preserving. That is not a short tradition. That is an unbroken thread of ecological testimony stretching from the earliest human habitation of the continent to the present. The Terra Preta distribution adds another layer of geographic overlap. Terra Preta, the anthropogenic dark earth created by centuries of pre-Columbian settlement, marks the locations of the Amazon's largest prehistoric civilizations. Terra Preta is found across many parts of the Amazon, often near waterways that supported long-term settlement. In some areas, those archaeological footprints overlap with the same river corridors that later stories and reports emphasize. But overlap isn't proof of causation. This does not establish a causal connection between large civilizations and large serpents, but it does establish that for thousands of years, dense human populations lived, fished, and built along the exact waterways where the Cobra Grande tradition is strongest. Their oral records of the creatures sharing those waters are not the invention of isolated individuals. They are the accumulated testimony of hundreds of generations of people who knew those rivers intimately. The geoglyphs discovered in Acre State, enormous geometric earthworks visible only from the air, revealed as the modern deforestation cleared forest that had grown over them, discoveries and wider documentation of geoglyphs, especially from the early 2000s onward, helped push the conversation toward a bigger picture of pre-Columbian Amazonia. More complex, more engineered, and in many places more densely inhabited than older narratives suggested. That revision, of the human archaeological record in the Western Amazon has a direct implication for the biological record. If the scale of human habitation in this region was systematically underestimated for decades, the baseline for what the ecosystem supported, including its apex predators, may have been underestimated in parallel. The Amazon keeps revising upward what was possible here. What would a rigorous attempt to resolve the question actually require? Setting aside the ethical and legal constraints of the Javari territory, constraints that exist for critical human rights reasons and cannot be wished away, a genuine survey would need acoustic sonar mapping of major deep-water channels across multiple seasonal cycles, environmental DNA sampling of flooded forest backwaters during peak inundation, aerial thermal imaging during cold early morning hours when large ectotherms seek surface warmth, and a systematic network of waterproof camera traps at Oxbow Lake margins across multiple years. Environmental DNA technology, the sampling of water for genetic material shed by organisms passing through it, is now sensitive enough to detect the presence of large reptiles in water systems without requiring direct observation. Environmental DNA has been used in multiple regions to detect elusive aquatic and semi-aquatic species without needing a direct sighting. In principle, it could help test presence questions in remote river corridors, if applied systematically and ethically. It has not been systematically applied to the flooded forest backwaters of the Javari-Juruá corridor. The reasons are logistical, financial, and jurisdictional, not scientific. The science exists. The application has not happened. If it did, the results would either add a layer of empirical confirmation to 100 years of reports, or they would provide the first rigorous basis for setting an upper bound on what actually inhabits those waters. Either outcome would be significant. The ongoing absence of the attempt is its own kind of data. The behavioral consistency across independent accounts deserves a final reckoning before any conclusions are drawn. Multiple witnesses, separated by decades and hundreds of kilometers, with no documented contact with one another, describe not merely large anacondas, but anacondas displaying a specific behavioral anomaly. They do not flee. Standard green anacondas are cryptic and largely avoid confrontation with large objects. Yet accounts from river surveyors, field naturalists, and riverino fishermen across the Juruá and Javari record animals that held position at the surface maintained proximity to vessels or moved toward rather than away from observers. Whether this represents a behavioral shift associated with extreme size, animals so large that a boat represents no credible threat and triggers no flight response, or whether it represents something else, cannot be determined from the current data. But the behavioral pattern appears consistently enough across independent accounts to constitute a genuine observation rather than an artifact of storytelling. A creature that does not flee is a creature that is not afraid, and a creature in the Western Amazon that has no reason to be afraid of a boat is a creature that has reached the end of its food chain. The Amazon does not give up its accounting easily. The 100-year sighting record assembled in these expedition logs is not a collection of fabrications and misidentifications, not entirely, not mostly. It is a documentation project conducted without coordination, without funding, without institutional support, and often at personal professional cost to the witnesses who committed their observations to paper. The pattern that emerges from that documentation, the clustering, the consistency, the convergence on a specific geographic zone defined by precise ecological characteristics, confirmed by independent biological reasoning, is not the shape of myth. It is the shape of a hypothesis that has not yet been tested because the tools to test it have not been applied where the evidence points. What lives in those channels, whether it represents a population at the physiological upper extreme of what the species can achieve, or something the current literature has not yet formally described, remains exactly where the Amazon prefers to keep its most important truths, beneath blackwater, in territory where no measuring tape has reached, patient in the way that only very old, very large things can be patient. The forest remembers what it has sheltered. It is not yet ready to show us everything. Perhaps that is precisely how it should be. Or perhaps one day, in a flooded backwater of the upper Juruá, a camera trap bolted to a submerged root will record something that rewrites a very long chapter of natural history, not as discovery, but as confirmation of what the river people have always known. If the distance between what is officially recorded and what the river insists it holds feels like the most important distance in the world, this channel was made for that distance. Subscribe to Secrets of the Amazon Jungle and never stop asking what the water remembers.